The morning mist hung low over the military training ground as Sarah Martinez knelt behind her M24 sniper rifle. Her calloused fingers moved with practiced precision, adjusting the scope's elevation knob in tiny increments. The target stood impossibly far away, a mere speck against the distant hillside at 3,400 meters. Most snipers considered anything beyond 2,000 meters to be nearly impossible, but Sarah had always pushed boundaries that others wouldn't dare approach. She had been at this for 3 hours already, her olive-green uniform damp with morning dew. The other soldiers had long since finished their standard shooting drills and returned to the barracks, but Sarah remained. This wasn't about meeting requirements or impressing instructors. This was personal. Every adjustment to her rifle, every calculation of wind speed and bullet drop, represented years of dedication that had cost her everything she once held dear. Growing up in a small Texas town, Sarah had learned to shoot with her grandfather's old hunting rifle. While other girls her age were playing with dolls, she was learning to read wind patterns and calculate distances. Her grandfather, a World War II veteran, had recognized something special in his granddaughter's steady hands and keen eye. He taught her that shooting wasn't just about pulling a trigger, it was about patience, discipline, and understanding the relationship between shooter, weapon, and target. The military had been Sarah's escape from a life that seemed predetermined. Small-town expectations weighed heavily on young women, and Sarah had felt suffocated by the assumption that she would marry young, have children, and never venture beyond the county lines. When she enlisted at 18, her family had been supportive but worried. They understood her need for something more, but they couldn't comprehend the level of commitment she would bring to her service. Basic training had been challenging, but not in the ways Sarah had expected. Physically, she excelled. Her small frame and natural athleticism served her well in the demanding exercises. Mentally, she absorbed tactical knowledge like a sponge, but socially, she struggled to find her place among her fellow soldiers. Many of the men questioned whether a woman belonged in combat roles, while some of the women felt she was trying too hard to prove herself in a man's world. It was during advanced marksmanship training that Sarah truly found her calling. While other soldiers struggled with long-distance shots, Sarah consistently hit targets that seemed impossible to reach. Her instructors took notice, recommending her for specialized sniper training. This was where Sarah discovered that her childhood lessons with her grandfather had laid the foundation for something extraordinary. Sniper school pushed Sarah beyond every limit she thought she had. The physical demands were brutal, the mental pressure intense, and the technical requirements seemed endless. Students were expected to master not just shooting, but camouflage, stalking, range estimation, weather analysis, and battlefield psychology. Many of her classmates dropped out within the first few weeks, unable to handle the combination of physical stress and mental demands. Sarah thrived. She approached each challenge methodically, breaking down complex problems into manageable components. When other students struggled with calculating bullet trajectories at extreme distances, Sarah spent her free time studying ballistics tables until she could perform the calculations instinctively. When camouflage exercises left classmates exposed and eliminated, Sarah learned to become invisible, moving through terrain without leaving a trace. Her instructors began to take special notice of her abilities. Staff Sergeant Williams, a veteran sniper with deployments in 3 different conflicts, pulled Sarah aside one evening after a particularly challenging exercise. She had successfully stalked and engaged targets at ranges that most students couldn't even see clearly, let alone hit accurately. "Martinez," he said, his weathered face serious in the dim light of the training facility. "I've been doing this for 15 years and I've trained hundreds of snipers. What you did out there today, that's not normal. That's not even exceptional. That's something else entirely." Sarah had felt a mixture of pride and uncertainty at his words. She knew she was performing well, but she hadn't realized just how unusual her abilities were. Staff Sergeant Williams explained that most snipers were effective at ranges up to 2,500 meters with standard equipment. Exceptional snipers might reach out to 2,000 meters under perfect conditions, but Sarah was consistently hitting targets at distances that pushed the absolute limits of her rifle's capabilities. The training became more intensive. Sarah found herself working with specialized equipment, learning advanced techniques that weren't part of the standard curriculum. She studied the effects of atmospheric pressure on bullet flight, learned to read mirage patterns that could indicate wind conditions at the target, and practiced shooting in conditions that would challenge even veteran snipers. Now, months later, Sarah knelt on the range with her M24, attempting something that would cement her reputation forever. The 3,400-meter shot was beyond the rifle's intended maximum effective range, but Sarah had calculated every variable. She had studied the ballistics, accounted for the bullet drop, estimated the wind patterns, and adjusted for the morning temperature and humidity. Everything pointed to this shot being possible if everything went perfectly. She controlled her breathing, feeling her heart rate slow as she entered the focused state that had become second nature. Through her scope, the distant target appeared as little more than a smudge against the hillside. Sarah made one final adjustment to her scope, accounting for the slight crosswind she could feel against her cheek. Her finger found the trigger, applying pressure gradually until the rifle fired with its familiar sharp crack that echoed across the empty range. The bullet's flight time at 3,400 meters gave Sarah several seconds to wonder if she had made a mistake. At that distance, even a minor miscalculation would send the projectile far from its intended target. She kept her eye pressed to the scope, watching for any sign that her shot had found its mark. The seconds stretched endlessly as the bullet traveled its arcing path through the morning air. Then she saw it. A tiny puff of dust kicked up exactly where the target stood. Through her powerful scope, Sarah could see the clean hole punched through the center of the bullseye. She had done it. She had achieved something that most military manuals would classify as impossible with standard equipment. Sarah slowly lifted her head from the scope, her mind still processing what had just happened. She had spent weeks preparing for this attempt, studying every variable that could affect the shot. Weather conditions had to be perfect, her equipment had to be functioning flawlessly, and her own physical and mental state had to be absolutely optimal. All of these factors had aligned, but even she hadn't been completely certain the shot was achievable. What she didn't know was that she hadn't been alone on the range that morning. General Patricia Hayes had arrived at the base for a routine inspection of training facilities. The general had built her career on recognizing exceptional talent and ensuring that the military's most capable personnel were utilized effectively. She had been touring the range facilities when she heard the distinctive crack of a sniper rifle from the far end of the complex. Curious about who would be training at such an early hour, General Hayes had made her way to the 3,400-meter range. What she observed through her field binoculars left her stunned. She watched as a lone soldier made minute adjustments to an M24 rifle, taking time to analyze conditions that most marksmen would never consider. The general had witnessed countless training exercises, but something about this soldier's methodical approach indicated a level of skill that was extraordinary. When the shot was fired, General Hayes followed the bullet's trajectory through her binoculars. She saw the impact on the distant target and immediately understood the significance of what she had witnessed. The general had served alongside some of the military's finest marksmen during her career, including legendary snipers whose achievements were classified at the highest levels. She knew that what she had just observed placed this unknown soldier among the most skilled shooters in military history. Sarah was carefully cleaning her rifle when she heard footsteps approaching behind her. She turned to see a figure in dress uniform walking across the range, and her heart nearly stopped when she recognized the stars on the approaching officer's collar. General Hayes was a legend in military circles, known for her strategic brilliance and her unwavering support of exceptional soldiers regardless of gender or background. "Soldier," General Hayes said as she approached, her voice carrying the authority that came from decades of command experience. "I just witnessed something remarkable. Would you mind explaining how you managed that shot?" Sarah quickly stood at attention, her mind racing as she tried to process the situation. She had been so focused on her shooting that she hadn't noticed anyone else on the range. Now she found herself face to face with one of the military's most respected leaders, trying to explain an achievement that she was still struggling to believe herself. "Ma'am," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her surprise. I've been working on extending my effective range for several months. I calculated the ballistics for this distance and waited for optimal atmospheric conditions. This morning, everything aligned perfectly. General Hayes studied Sarah carefully. She had learned to read people during her years of command, and she could see that this young soldier possessed something rare. There was confidence without arrogance, precision without rigidity, and dedication without obsession. These were the qualities that separated truly exceptional personnel from merely competent ones. "What's your current assignment, soldier?" General Hayes asked. "I'm completing advanced marksmanship training, ma'am. I'm scheduled to deploy with a reconnaissance unit in 6 weeks." The general nodded thoughtfully. She knew that reconnaissance units rarely utilize snipers with capabilities this extraordinary. It would be like using a precision instrument for basic construction work. This soldier's abilities needed to be recognized and properly channeled. "Have you documented this shot?" General Hayes inquired. "No, ma'am. This was personal training. On my own time, I didn't think it was necessary to file a report." General Hayes understood. Many of the military's most capable personnel pushed themselves beyond official requirements during their personal time. They were driven by internal standards that exceeded any external expectations. However, this particular achievement needed to be properly recorded and verified. "Soldier, I want you to repeat that shot with witnesses present and proper documentation. If you can consistently perform at this level, it will change your career trajectory significantly." Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She had joined the military to serve her country and push herself beyond civilian limitations, but she hadn't expected her abilities to attract attention at this level. She understood that General Hayes's interest could open doors to opportunities that few soldiers ever experienced. Over the next hour, General Hayes arranged for range officers to document Sarah's capabilities officially. A team of instructors arrived with measuring equipment and cameras to verify the distance and record the results. The general wanted absolute certainty about what she had witnessed. Sarah found herself under intense scrutiny as she prepared for her second attempt at the 3,400-meter shot. The presence of multiple observers added pressure, but her training had prepared her for performing under stress. She went through her methodical routine, checking and rechecking every variable that could affect the shot. The second bullet struck within inches of the first hole. The third shot, fired 10 minutes later after atmospheric conditions had changed slightly, hit the opposite edge of the bullseye. 3 shots at 3,400 meters, all within the target zone, documented and witnessed by senior military personnel. General Hayes knew she had discovered something extraordinary. This soldier's capabilities extended far beyond normal sniper training. She represented potential that could be utilized in ways that would benefit national security significantly. 3 days after her encounter with General Hayes, Sarah received orders that changed everything. Instead of the standard deployment she had expected, she found herself summoned to a classified briefing at a facility she had never seen before. The building looked unremarkable from the outside, but once inside, Sarah realized she had entered a world that operated far beyond normal military protocols. The briefing room was small and windowless, with walls covered in maps that showed regions she couldn't immediately identify. Seated around a polished table were officers whose uniforms bore insignia she didn't recognize. General Hayes sat at the head of the table, her expression serious as Sarah entered and took the indicated seat. "Specialist Martinez," General Hayes began. "What I'm about to discuss with you is classified at the highest levels. Before we continue, I need you to understand that accepting this assignment will fundamentally change your military career. You'll be operating in environments and situations that most soldiers never experience." Sarah listened intently as General Hayes outlined a mission that seemed to belong in a spy novel rather than her military reality. Intelligence agencies had identified several high-value targets in regions where traditional military operations would be impossible. These individuals posed significant threats to national security, but they operated from locations that conventional forces couldn't reach without creating international incidents. What was needed was a sniper capable of making shots that others would consider impossible, someone who could operate independently in hostile territory and eliminate threats from distances that would keep American involvement completely undetectable. Sarah's demonstrated abilities at 3,400 meters had proven that she could engage targets from ranges that would leave no forensic evidence linking attacks to American forces. The mission details were staggering in their complexity. Sarah would be infiltrated into a region where hostile forces controlled most of the territory. She would have to survive independently for weeks, gathering intelligence and positioning herself for shots that would require every skill she had developed. The targets were individuals whose activities threatened American interests, but their elimination had to appear completely unconnected to any government action. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of what was being proposed. This went far beyond anything she had imagined when she enlisted. The technical challenges alone were extraordinary, requiring her to operate with minimal support in conditions that would test every aspect of her training. But beyond the technical requirements, she would be carrying moral responsibilities that few soldiers ever faced. General Hayes could see Sarah's internal struggle. She had witnessed this same reaction from other exceptional soldiers when they were offered assignments that transcended normal military service. The decision to accept such missions couldn't be made lightly, and it required individuals who possessed not just exceptional skills, but also the character to handle the psychological demands. "I understand this is a lot to process, General," Hayes said gently. "You don't need to decide immediately. Take time to consider whether this is the path you want to pursue. But I want you to understand something important. The threats these individuals pose are real and immediate. Without intervention, their actions will result in the deaths of innocent people on a scale that's difficult to comprehend." Over the following days, Sarah struggled with the decision. She had joined the military to serve her country, but she had envisioned that service in more traditional terms. Combat operations, protecting fellow soldiers, defending American interests through conventional means. This assignment represented something entirely different, requiring her to operate in moral gray areas that challenged her fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. She thought about her grandfather's stories from World War II, when clear lines existed between good and evil, when soldiers fought against enemies who wore uniforms and represented obvious threats to freedom. The modern world, she was learning, operated in more complex ways. Threats came from individuals who hid among civilian populations, who used the very freedoms they sought to destroy as protection for their activities. Sarah also considered her own capabilities. She had pushed herself to achieve extraordinary skills as a marksman, but she had never truly considered how those abilities might be utilized. The 3,400-meter shot that had attracted General Hayes's attention represented years of dedicated training and natural talent working together. To refuse this assignment would mean that her abilities would be used for routine military operations that any competent sniper could handle. The deciding factor came when Sarah was shown classified intelligence about the specific targets she would be tasked with eliminating. The evidence was overwhelming and disturbing. These individuals were orchestrating attacks on civilian populations, funding terrorist operations, and developing capabilities that posed existential threats to regional stability. Their continued activities would inevitably result in massive loss of innocent life. Sarah realized that her unique capabilities gave her the power to prevent tragedies that others couldn't stop. The extraordinary range at which she could operate meant that she could eliminate threats without endangering other personnel or creating collateral damage. Her skills, developed through years of personal dedication, could serve a purpose that transcended her own ambitions or concerns. When she returned to the briefing room to give her answer, Sarah found General Hayes waiting alone. The other officers had departed, leaving just the two of them to discuss the implications of Sarah's decision. "I'll accept the assignment," Sarah said simply. General Hayes nodded, her expression showing both satisfaction and concern. She had hoped Sarah would accept, but she also understood the burdens that came with such missions. Soldiers who operated at this level carried psychological weights that could be overwhelming if they weren't properly prepared and supported. "There's something else you need to understand," General Hayes said. "Once you begin operating at this level, your service record will be largely classified. Your achievements may never be publicly recognized, Your family and friends may never fully understand the significance of your contributions to national security. Sarah had already considered these implications. The recognition she had received for her marksmanship skills had been gratifying, but it wasn't what motivated her. She was driven by the desire to use her abilities in service of something larger than herself. If that service had to remain secret, she was prepared for that sacrifice. The following weeks became the most intensive training period of Sarah's military career. She worked with specialists in covert operations, learning skills that went far beyond marksmanship: survival techniques, camouflage, evasion, languages, cultural studies, and psychological preparation for operating completely alone in hostile territory. The infiltration into hostile territory happened on a moonless night when cloud cover obscured any possibility of detection from above. Sarah found herself parachuting into a landscape that looked nothing like the training grounds where she had honed her skills. The terrain was rugged and unforgiving, with steep mountains rising from valleys that provided perfect cover for the criminal organizations that controlled this region. She landed several kilometers from her target area, immediately burying her parachute and beginning the methodical process of transforming herself from an American soldier into a ghost who could survive undetected in enemy territory. Her equipment had been carefully selected to leave no trace of its origin. Her rifle bore no manufacturer markings, her ammunition was untraceable, and even her clothing could have been purchased in local markets. The first days were the most dangerous. Sarah had to reach her designated observation position without being detected by the numerous armed patrols that swept through the area. She moved only at night, covering ground with a patience that would have frustrated anyone not trained in covert operations. During daylight hours, she remained completely hidden, studying the terrain and memorizing every detail that might be relevant to her mission. Her target was a man named Viktor Kozlov, whose activities had drawn the attention of multiple intelligence agencies. Kozlov operated a network that smuggled weapons to terrorist organizations while simultaneously trafficking in human beings and narcotics. His operations generated millions of dollars that funded attacks on civilian populations across multiple continents. Traditional law enforcement couldn't reach him because he operated from a heavily fortified compound in territory controlled by his allies. Sarah's intelligence briefings had provided detailed information about Kozlov's daily routines, but she quickly discovered that reality was more complicated than intelligence reports suggested. Security around the compound was more extensive than anticipated, with multiple layers of guards and surveillance systems that would make close approach impossible for conventional operatives. However, Sarah's unique capabilities meant that she didn't need to get close. Her mission parameters called for her to establish a firing position at a distance that would make detection impossible, while still allowing her to eliminate the target with absolute certainty. She had trained for shots at extreme range, but this mission would test every skill she had developed. After days of careful observation, Sarah identified a position on a ridge overlooking the compound from a distance of nearly 4,000 meters. This was beyond the range at which most snipers would consider a shot possible, but Sarah's training had prepared her for precisely these conditions. The position offered clear sight lines to areas where Kozlov appeared regularly, while being far enough away that her muzzle flash and sound signature would be undetectable. Establishing her position required another week of careful preparation. Sarah had to move equipment to the ridge without leaving any traces that could be discovered later. She created a hide that would allow her to observe the compound for extended periods, while remaining completely invisible to anyone searching the area. Every aspect of her position was designed to ensure that after her mission was complete, no evidence would remain of her presence. The psychological demands of the mission were unlike anything Sarah had experienced in training. She was completely alone in hostile territory, with no possibility of extraction or support if things went wrong. Communications with her handlers were limited to brief, coded messages transmitted at predetermined intervals. For weeks, she would have only her own resources and training to rely upon. During her surveillance of the compound, Sarah began to understand the full scope of Kozlov's operations. She watched as vehicles arrived carrying human cargo that was clearly destined for trafficking networks. She observed meetings between Kozlov and representatives of terrorist organizations, seeing weapons transfers that would eventually be used against innocent civilians. The intelligence briefings had outlined these activities, but witnessing them directly reinforced Sarah's understanding of why her mission was necessary. Kozlov himself proved to be a careful man who rarely exposed himself to potential threats. His movements were unpredictable, and when he did appear in open areas, it was usually for brief periods that would challenge even Sarah's abilities. She realized that she would have only one opportunity to complete her mission, and everything would depend on perfect execution under conditions that allowed no margin for error. The shot, when it finally came, required Sarah to draw upon every skill she had developed throughout her career. Weather conditions were marginal, with variable winds that changed the ballistics calculation significantly. The range was at the absolute limit of what was possible with her equipment. The target exposure time would be measured in seconds, requiring her to fire without the luxury of multiple sighting shots or adjustments. Sarah had been in position for 18 hours when Kozlov finally appeared in her scope. He emerged from the main building of the compound and walked toward a vehicle that was waiting in the courtyard. Through her powerful optics, Sarah could see him clearly, despite the enormous distance. This was her opportunity, and she knew another might not come. The calculations ran through her mind automatically, years of training allowing her to account for every variable that would affect the bullet's flight: wind speed and direction, atmospheric pressure, temperature, humidity, the slight upward angle of the shot, even the rotation of the Earth over the bullet's flight time. Sarah made minute adjustments to her scope, feeling her breathing and heart rate settle into the rhythm that preceded every important shot. The rifle fired with its familiar crack, the sound echoing off the surrounding mountains but dissipating long before it could reach the distant compound. Sarah kept her eye on the scope, tracking the target during the bullet's flight time. At 4,000 meters, she had several seconds to observe Kozlov's movements and confirm that her calculations had been correct. The impact was instantaneous and decisive. Through her scope, Sarah saw Kozlov collapse, the precision of the shot leaving, no doubt about the outcome. Guards rushed to the scene, but their confusion was evident. The shot had come from such an extreme range that they had no idea where to look for the shooter. Sarah remained in position for several hours, observing the compound's response to ensure that her location remained uncompromised. The chaos below confirmed that her mission had been successful, but it also reinforced the isolation of her position. She was alone on a mountain ridge in hostile territory, with no immediate way to communicate her success or begin her extraction. The hours following Kozlov's elimination were the most dangerous of Sarah's mission. She knew that hostile forces would eventually expand their search for the shooter, and her position on the ridge would become increasingly vulnerable as daylight improved visibility across the valley. Her extraction plan required her to remain undetected for 48 hours before reaching the designated pickup point, a challenge that would test her survival skills as much as her marksmanship had been tested. Sarah methodically dismantled her position, ensuring that no trace remained of her presence. Every piece of equipment was carefully packed. Every disturbance in the natural environment was restored to its original state. The hide that had concealed her for weeks was collapsed and camouflaged so thoroughly that even trained trackers would find no evidence that anyone had ever been there. Movement during daylight was impossible, so Sarah found temporary concealment in a rocky outcropping and settled in to wait for darkness. Through her binoculars, she could observe the increased activity around Kozlov's compound. Vehicles were arriving constantly, bringing additional security personnel and what appeared to be investigators trying to determine how the attack had been carried out. The investigation efforts gave Sarah valuable intelligence about her own operational security. Search teams were focusing their attention on areas within 1,500 meters of the compound, the range at which conventional snipers would typically operate. No one was looking in the direction of her actual position, confirming that the extreme range of her shot had provided perfect concealment. As night fell, Sarah began her movement toward the extraction point. The terrain was treacherous in darkness, with loose rocks and steep slopes that could easily result in falls or injuries that would compromise her mission. She moved with the deliberate pace that her training had taught her, testing each step carefully before committing her full weight. The extraction point was located in a valley 30 kilometers from her firing position, requiring Sarah to traverse some of the most difficult terrain in the region. She had studied topographical maps extensively during her mission planning, but navigating by night through unfamiliar mountains presented challenges that maps couldn't fully convey. By dawn, Sarah had covered less than half the required distance. She found concealment in a dense forest and spent the day observing the surrounding area for any signs of hostile activity. Radio intercepts indicated that search efforts were intensifying, but the focus remained on areas closer to the compound. During her second night of movement, Sarah encountered the first serious threat to her escape. A patrol of armed men was moving through the valley she needed to cross, their routes suggesting they were conducting systematic sweeps of potential escape corridors. Sarah spent hours observing their patterns, identifying the timing and routes that would allow her to pass through their coverage area undetected. The crossing required precise timing and absolute silence. Sarah waited until the patrol had passed her position, then moved quickly across the exposed valley floor. She reached the far side just as another patrol appeared in the distance, their searchlights sweeping the area she had just vacated. The final approach to the extraction point presented unique challenges. Sarah had to coordinate her arrival with a helicopter pickup that could only remain in hostile airspace for minutes. The timing had to be perfect, because delays would force the aircraft to abort and leave Sarah stranded with no alternative extraction. Planned communication with the extraction team was limited to brief coded signals that had to be transmitted at precisely scheduled intervals. Sarah reached the designated coordinates with 2 hours to spare, allowing her to establish observation of the landing zone and confirm that no hostile forces were in position to interfere with the pickup. The helicopter appeared exactly on schedule, flying low and fast to minimize its exposure to potential ground fire. The pilot was clearly experienced in combat operations, bringing the aircraft into a hover just long enough for Sarah to board before immediately departing the area. During the flight to safety, Sarah finally allowed herself to acknowledge the magnitude of what she had accomplished. The mission had required her to operate completely alone in hostile territory, execute a shot at an unprecedented range under combat conditions, and successfully escape without detection. Every aspect of her training had been tested, and she had performed flawlessly. General Hayes was waiting when Sarah's transport arrived at the secure facility where she would be debriefed. The general's expression showed satisfaction mixed with concern, reflecting her understanding of both the mission's importance and the psychological toll such operations could exact on even the most capable personnel. "Outstanding work, Specialist," General Hayes said as Sarah reported in. "Initial intelligence indicates that Kozlov's organization is already fragmenting without his leadership. The network that was funding terrorist operations across 3 continents has been effectively disrupted." The debriefing process took several days, with intelligence analysts extracting every detail of Sarah's observations and experiences. Her mission had provided valuable information about hostile capabilities and operations that went far beyond the primary objective of eliminating Kozlov. However, Sarah found the transition back to normal military routine more difficult than she had anticipated. Weeks of operating alone in life-threatening conditions had changed her in ways that weren't immediately apparent. The hypervigilance required for survival in hostile territory didn't easily fade when she returned to the safety of military bases. General Hayes recognized these symptoms from her experience with other personnel who had conducted similar missions. She arranged for Sarah to work with specialists who understood the psychological demands of covert operations, ensuring that the transition back to normal duty would be properly managed. During their final meeting of the debriefing period, General Hayes presented Sarah with information that would reshape her understanding of her own capabilities and potential future assignments. Intelligence agencies had taken note of her unprecedented success, and several organizations were requesting her services for missions that would push her abilities even further. "Your performance has established you as one of the military's most valuable assets," General Hayes explained. "The combination of your marksmanship abilities and your demonstrated capacity for independent operations in hostile territory makes you uniquely qualified for missions that others simply cannot execute." Sarah learned that her success had opened doors to opportunities that few soldiers ever experienced, but these opportunities came with responsibilities that would continue to challenge her both professionally and personally. The life she had chosen was leading her further from conventional military service and deeper into a world where individual capabilities could influence global events. 6 months after her return from the Kozlov mission, Sarah found herself in a position she had never imagined when she first picked up her grandfather's hunting rifle. She had been quietly transferred to a unit that officially didn't exist, working on assignments that would never appear in any public military records. Her success rate was perfect, her capabilities were unmatched, and her reputation among those who knew of her work had reached legendary status. The training facility where Sarah now worked looked like any other military installation from the UA. Outside but inside it housed some of the most advanced marksmanship technology in the world. She had access to rifles and equipment that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible, allowing her to attempt shots that would have been inconceivable with standard military hardware. Her days were spent in continuous preparation for missions that arrived with little warning and demanded immediate execution. Sarah trained on ranges that replicated conditions from around the world, practiced with weapon systems that were customized specifically for her abilities, and studied intelligence briefings about threats that conventional military forces couldn't address. The psychological aspects of her work had become as important as the technical skills. Sarah worked with specialists who helped her process the moral complexities of her assignments while maintaining the emotional stability necessary for peak performance. She had learned that eliminating threats at extreme range required not just physical precision, but also mental clarity that could only be maintained through careful psychological preparation. General Hayes remained Sarah's primary contact with the larger military structure, serving as both commander and mentor as Sarah's career evolved in directions that had no precedent. The general had become deeply invested in ensuring that Sarah's extraordinary abilities were utilized effectively, while protecting her from the institutional pressures that could easily overwhelm someone in her unique position. During one of their regular meetings, General Hayes presented Sarah with intelligence about a threat that would require every skill she had developed. A terrorist organization had acquired materials that could be used to create weapons of mass destruction, and their leader was planning to oversee their deployment personally. The individual was known to intelligence agencies, but he operated from a location that made conventional military action impossible. "This is unlike anything you've faced before," General Hayes explained as she outlined the mission parameters. "The target location is in an urban environment with significant civilian population. The range requirements exceed even your previous achievements, and the window of opportunity will be measured in seconds." Sarah studied the mission briefings with the methodical approach that had become her trademark. The target would be appearing at a specific location for a brief ceremonial event, providing the only opportunity to eliminate him before he could proceed with his planned attacks. The shot would have to be made from a building several kilometers away, through an urban environment that would complicate ballistics calculations significantly. The technical challenges were staggering. Urban environments created unpredictable wind patterns as air currents bounced off buildings and streets. The range was at the absolute limit of what Sarah's customized equipment could achieve. The target would be exposed for less than 30 seconds, requiring her to fire without the luxury of ranging shots or adjustments. Preparation for the mission required Sarah to work with urban warfare specialists, architects who could analyze building structures, and meteorologists who could predict atmospheric conditions in city environments. Every variable that could affect the shot had to be calculated and planned for, because there would be no second chances. The insertion into the target city happened during a period of civil unrest that provided perfect cover for Sarah's activities. She entered the country as a journalist, carrying credentials and equipment that would withstand casual scrutiny while concealing the specialized gear necessary for her mission. Establishing her position required Sarah to gain access to a building that provided the necessary sight lines while remaining completely undetected by building security and law enforcement agencies. She spent days conducting surveillance, identifying entry routes and escape paths that would allow her to complete the mission without being discovered. The shot itself required Sarah to draw upon every lesson she had learned throughout her career. The range was 4,200 meters, further than she had ever attempted under combat conditions. The urban environment created atmospheric conditions that changed constantly as the day progressed. The target would appear for exactly 28 seconds, based on intelligence analysis of his previous public appearances. Sarah had been in position for 6 hours when the target finally appeared in her scope. Through her optics, she could see him clearly despite the enormous distance. A man whose death would prevent attacks that could kill thousands of innocent people. The weight of responsibility was immense, but Sarah's training had prepared her for precisely this moment. The rifle fired with its familiar precision, sending a bullet on a trajectory that curved through the urban atmosphere before finding its target with devastating accuracy. The impact was immediate and decisive, eliminating a threat that intelligence agencies had been tracking for years. Sarah remained in position for several minutes, observing the scene through her scope to confirm the mission's success and assess any immediate threats to her position. The chaos below confirmed that her shot had achieved its objective, but it also began the countdown to her extraction from an increasingly dangerous situation. The escape from the target city tested every aspect of Sarah's training in urban operations. She had to navigate through streets filled with security forces responding to the incident, while avoiding surveillance systems that could identify her presence. Her extraction route had been carefully planned, but the reality of moving through a city in lockdown presented challenges that required constant adaptation. 3 days later, Sarah found herself back in the secure briefing room where her career had transformed months earlier. General Hayes was waiting with the expression that mixed pride, concern, and something else that Sarah couldn't immediately identify. The mission was a complete success, General Hayes began. Intelligence indicates that the terrorist organization has fractured without their leader, and the weapons materials have been secured by friendly forces. Your actions prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on civilian populations. But Sarah could sense that something had changed in her relationship with General Hayes. The general's next words confirmed her suspicions. However, your capabilities have attracted attention at levels that concern me. There are requests for your services from agencies and organizations that operate with even less oversight than we do. Some of these requests involve missions that would take you into areas where the moral clarity of your current assignments might not exist. Sarah understood the implications immediately. Her success had established her as a resource that various organizations wanted to utilize, but not all of these organizations necessarily shared the same commitment to protecting innocent lives that had motivated her previous missions. I need you to understand something important, General Hayes continued. You have developed capabilities that make you one of the most valuable assets in the global intelligence community. But with those capabilities comes the responsibility to ensure they are used for purposes that align with your own values and principles. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself at a crossroads that would define the rest of her career. Offers arrived for missions that would utilize her skills, but might compromise the ethical framework that had sustained her through her most challenging assignments. The financial compensation being offered was staggering, and the operational freedom would be unprecedented. But Sarah had learned something important during her journey from a small-town girl with a hunting rifle to one of the world's most capable snipers. Technical skill alone was not enough to sustain a career in covert operations. The moral foundation that guided her decisions was as important as her ability to make impossible shots under extreme conditions. Her decision, when she finally made it, surprised many of the officials who had been courting her services. Instead of accepting the lucrative offers from private organizations, Sarah chose to remain with General Hayes's unit, accepting assignments that maintained the clear moral framework that had sustained her through her most difficult missions. Years later, Sarah's achievements would remain largely unknown to the public. Her service record was classified at levels that would keep her contributions secret for decades. But among the small community of professionals who understood the significance of her work, she was recognized as someone who had redefined what was possible in the field of precision marksmanship. The young woman who had once knelt on a training range, adjusting her M24 rifle for an impossible shot, had become a legend whose capabilities had influenced global events in ways that few people would ever know. Her journey from that first 3,400-meter shot to missions that spanned continents had proven that individual excellence guided by strong principles could indeed change the world. Sarah continued to serve, knowing that her unique combination of skills and character made her irreplaceable in a role that demanded both technical perfection and unwavering moral clarity. She had found her purpose in service to something larger than herself, using abilities that few possessed to protect those who would never know her name or understand the threats she had eliminated. The legend of the sniper who could make impossible shots had grown quietly in the shadows, known only to those who needed to know, but serving as inspiration for a new generation of marksmen who understood that true excellence required more than just the ability to hit distant targets.